There comes a moment in life when the truth we have hidden behind silence finally reaches the person who needs to understand it. Not because we suddenly decide to confess everything, and not because we finally find the perfect words, but because sometimes another person sees what we have been unable or unwilling to explain. Think about how often you have said, "I'm fine," when you were anything but fine. How many times have you smiled because explaining your sadness felt exhausting? How many times have you walked away from someone you cared about, not because you stopped caring, but because you were afraid that getting closer would give them the power to hurt you? This is one of the great contradictions of human nature. We can desperately want to be understood, while simultaneously becoming experts at hiding ourselves. Psychologically, this makes sense. When a person has experienced disappointment, rejection, betrayal, or emotional instability, the mind begins creating protective strategies. You become cautious, you stop revealing everything. You learn to read people's behavior before trusting their words. You may even convince yourself that you do not need anyone, because needing someone once came with a price. And eventually your protection can become so familiar that other people mistake it for your personality. They see your silence and call you distant. They see your independence and assume you are emotionally unavailable. They see your strength and conclude that nothing affects you. They see you walking away and assume you never cared. But they don't see the history behind the behavior. They don't see the nights you questioned your own worth. They don't see the moments when you wanted someone to ask what's really going on. They don't see how many times you chose silence because you didn't want to become a burden. They don't see the emotional battles that taught you to survive without asking for help. And that is why this moment matters. When someone finally tells your soulmate the truth about your hidden pain, they are not simply giving them information, they are giving them context. Context changes everything. A behavior without context can look cruel. With context, it can become understandable. Silence can look like rejection until you discover it was fear. Distance can look like indifference until you learn it was self-protection. Hesitation can look like uncertainty until you understand that trust had to be rebuilt slowly. This does not mean every wound excuses every behavior. That's important. Healing is not about using your pain as permission to hurt others. It is about becoming conscious enough to understand why you respond the way you do, and then deciding whether those responses still serve the person you are becoming. That is real emotional maturity. And imagine what happens when your soulmate suddenly receives that missing piece of the story. Perhaps they remember conversations differently. Perhaps they replay certain moments in their mind. Maybe they realize that what they interpreted as you not caring was actually you caring so deeply that you became afraid. Maybe they recognize that you were not asking them to rescue you. You were simply hoping someone would understand that beneath your strength was a human being who had been carrying more than they ever admitted. That realization can be powerful, because people don't always fall in love with the version of us that looks perfect. Sometimes they connect most deeply when they finally understand the truth behind the mask. Your hidden pain does not make you weak, but neither does hiding it make you strong. Strength is being willing to say, "This happened to me, it affected me, but it does not have to control who I become." And when someone finally understands that story, something changes. The walls may not disappear overnight. Trust may still take time, but for the first time, someone is no longer judging the surface. They are beginning to understand the soul beneath it. So don't be ashamed of the chapters you survived. Learn from them. Speak about them when the right moment and the right person make honesty possible. Because the right connection does not require you to pretend you were never wounded. It gives you the courage to stop hiding the wound. And sometimes, being truly seen is the beginning of finally healing. There is a moment when understanding becomes deeper than attraction. It happens when someone stops looking only at what you do and begins asking why you do it. That distinction can completely transform a relationship, because human beings are rarely shaped by isolated moments. We are shaped by experiences, memories, disappointments, and the conclusions we quietly draw from them. And when your soulmate finally realizes how much you have suffered in silence, they may begin to reinterpret everything they once misunderstood about you. Maybe they remember the times you became quiet during difficult conversations. Maybe they remember how quickly you changed the subject whenever something became too personal. Maybe they noticed that you could be incredibly caring one day and strangely distant the next. From the outside, those contradictions can be confusing. But once the hidden story becomes visible, the contradiction begins to make sense. You were not necessarily cold, you were protecting something. Psychology teaches us that people often develop emotional defenses based on previous experiences. If vulnerability once resulted in rejection, embarrassment, betrayal, or disappointment, the mind learns a lesson. Vulnerability is dangerous, so the person adapts. They become more guarded. They stop explaining themselves. They keep certain feelings private, and eventually the defense becomes automatic. You don't consciously wake up and decide, "Today I'm going to hide my emotions." You simply respond according to what your experiences have taught you. That is why someone can genuinely want love while simultaneously being afraid of intimacy. They can crave connection and still pull away. They can want someone to stay and still tell that person to leave. They can desperately want to be understood and yet struggle to explain what they are feeling. To an untrained eye, this looks like inconsistency. To someone who understands emotional wounds, it can look like protection. And imagine your soulmate discovering that truth. Suddenly, the moments they considered confusing begin carrying a different meaning. They may realize that when you became distant, you were not necessarily trying to punish them. You may have been trying to regain emotional control. When you became unusually independent, perhaps you were reminding yourself that you could survive alone. When you refused to ask for help, maybe you had simply learned that depending on people could lead to disappointment. This realization can be uncomfortable because it forces a person to confront their own assumptions. And assumptions are dangerous in relationships. We often react not to reality, but to the story we have created about reality. Someone doesn't reply to your message, and you decide they don't care. Someone becomes quiet, and you decide they are angry. Someone needs space, and you decide they are leaving. But what if you knew the complete story? Your interpretation might change. That is why emotional understanding is so powerful. It gives you information that changes the meaning of behavior. And when your soulmate learns the truth about your pain, they may experience something unexpected: regret. Not necessarily because they intentionally hurt you, but because they realize they may have judged something they never fully understood. They may remember moments when you needed patience but received pressure. Moments when you needed reassurance but received assumptions. Moments when you were silently struggling while everyone around you assumed you were perfectly fine. That realization can hurt, but sometimes pain is what awakens compassion, and compassion is one of the deepest foundations of genuine love. Because love is not simply saying, "I want you." Love is being willing to understand you. It is asking, what has shaped you? What are you afraid of? What makes you feel safe? What do you need in order to trust? These questions create a completely different kind of connection. But there is another important truth here. Your soulmate cannot heal every wound you carry. They can understand you, they can support you, they can create an environment where honesty feels safe. But your healing remains your responsibility. That distinction matters. You are not looking for someone to rescue you from your past. You are looking for someone who respects the person you are becoming despite your past. And perhaps that is what makes this revelation so powerful. Your soulmate may finally stop seeing your scars as complications and start seeing them as evidence of your journey. They may realize that your strength was never the absence of pain. Your strength was continuing to love, hope, and move forward while carrying pain that nobody else could see. So if someone finally discovers what you have been carrying, don't immediately hide again. Let yourself be understood, not by everyone, but by the people who have earned the right to know your story. Because The deepest relationships are not built when two perfect people meet. They are built when two honest people finally stop pretending they have nothing to heal. And sometimes the moment someone understands your pain is the moment they finally understand you. There is a particular kind of moment that can change the emotional direction of a relationship in an instant. It happens when someone hears a truth they were never prepared to hear, and suddenly the person they thought they understood becomes an entirely different person in their mind. Your soulmate may have known your smile. They may have known your habits, your personality, your ambitions, your strengths. They may have watched you remain composed when life became difficult. But knowing someone's surface is not the same thing as understanding their story. And when the truth about your hidden pain finally reaches them, their reaction may not be what you expect. They may become quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because suddenly there is too much to process. Think about what happens when you discover that someone you thought was simply distant was actually protecting a wound. You don't just receive new information. You begin revisiting old memories. You remember conversations. You remember their expressions. You remember the moments they pulled away. You remember the questions they avoided answering. And suddenly, moments that once seemed confusing begin to make sense. That is where emotional shock often begins. Your soulmate may ask themselves, "How did I not know?" And that question can be painful, because sometimes the people closest to us don't recognize our suffering precisely because we became so good at hiding it. You learned how to function. You learned how to smile. You learned how to keep moving. You learned how to say, "I'm okay," without allowing your voice to reveal what was happening inside. And the world often rewards this kind of emotional performance. People admire the person who never complains. They call them strong. They praise their independence. They say, "You can handle anything." But there is a danger in constantly being perceived as strong. People may stop asking whether you need support. They may assume you don't need reassurance. They may believe that because you survived something, it didn't hurt you. Your soulmate may now be realizing that survival and healing are not the same thing. You can survive something and still carry its emotional consequences. You can forgive someone and still remember what happened. You can move forward and still have moments when the past speaks louder than the present. And when your soulmate discovers this, their first reaction might be sadness. They may feel sadness because they finally recognize how much you carried alone. They may feel sadness because they realize there were moments when you were hurting and they had no idea. They may even feel guilty for things they did, without understanding the effect those actions had on you. But there is something important to remember. Their emotional reaction does not automatically mean they're responsible for everything you have suffered. Sometimes people feel guilty simply because they care. They think, "If I had known, I would have treated them differently." And that thought can become a turning point, because knowledge creates responsibility. Once someone understands your emotional reality, they can no longer interact with you from the same assumptions. The relationship has new information, and information changes choices. Maybe they become more patient. Maybe they listen instead of immediately responding. Maybe they stop interpreting your silence as rejection. Maybe they finally understand why trust takes time for you. This is where compassion becomes more powerful than judgment. Judgment asks, "Why are you like this?" Compassion asks, "What happened that made you this way?" That single question can change everything. But perhaps the most unexpected part of their reaction is not sadness or regret. Perhaps it is tenderness. They may realize that beneath the person who appears strong is someone who simply wanted to feel safe. And safety is often what people are really searching for in love. Not perfection, not constant excitement, not endless promises. Safety, the ability to speak without being mocked, the ability to admit fear without being abandoned, the ability to say, "This hurts," without being told that you're too sensitive. When your soulmate understands this, they may begin approaching you differently. Not because they suddenly have all the answers, but because they finally understand that your heart requires patience, and that can be transformative. Still, don't mistake someone's emotional reaction for proof of destiny. A powerful reaction is only a beginning. What matters is what they do afterward. Do they respect your vulnerability? Do they become more consistent? Do they listen? Do they honor your boundaries? Do their actions match their newfound understanding? Because real love is not measured by how intensely someone reacts to your pain. It is measured by how responsibly they treat your heart after learning about it. That is the real test. So if your hidden pain is finally revealed, don't be ashamed of the tears, the silence, or the years you spent trying to survive. Your story does not make you less worthy of love. It makes your need for honest love more understandable. And when someone finally sees what you have been carrying, let their response teach you something too. Don't only listen to what they say, watch what they do. Because when someone truly understands your pain, their love should become more careful, their presence more consistent, and their actions more compassionate. The truth may surprise them, but what they do with that truth will reveal who they really are. There is a moment in every meaningful connection when attraction begins to give way to recognition. Attraction notices how someone looks, how they speak, how they make you feel. Recognition goes deeper. It says, "Now I understand something about you that I could not see before." And when your soulmate begins to understand what you have survived, they may start seeing your strength through an entirely different lens. For a long time, perhaps even you misunderstood your own strength. You may have believed strength meant never crying, never asking for help, never admitting that something hurt. You learned to keep functioning when your heart was exhausted. You learned to show up when you wanted to disappear. You learned to smile when there were questions inside you that had no answers. But that is survival. True strength is something deeper. True strength is the ability to acknowledge what happened without allowing it to dictate what happens next. And this distinction matters because pain can create an identity if we are not careful. A person can experience rejection and eventually start thinking, "I am someone people leave." Someone can experience betrayal and begin thinking, "Nobody can be trusted." Someone can be repeatedly disappointed and eventually decide expecting anything from people is foolish. These conclusions feel protective because they reduce uncertainty. If you expect nothing, you cannot be disappointed. If you never trust, you cannot be betrayed. If you never become vulnerable, nobody can use your vulnerability against you. But there is a hidden cost. The same walls that keep pain out can also keep love out. Your soulmate may now be realizing that what looked like emotional distance was actually a fortress built from experience, and suddenly they see your independence differently. They may have once thought, "This person doesn't need anyone." Now they may understand, "This person learned not to need anyone." Those are completely different statements. One describes confidence, the other describes adaptation, and when someone truly understands that distinction, their perception of you can change dramatically. They may begin to admire your resilience, not because they romanticize your suffering, but because they recognize what it took for you to continue. There is something profoundly human about realizing that the person standing in front of you has fought battles you never witnessed. You see someone successful, but you don't see the nights they questioned themselves. You see someone confident, but you don't see the years it took to rebuild their self-worth. You see someone calm, but you don't know how much emotional chaos they learned to manage privately. This is why we should be careful about judging people too quickly. Every person you meet is carrying a history you cannot see. Your soulmate may now understand this about you, and perhaps that understanding creates respect. Not pity, respect. Pity says, "You are broken, and I feel sorry for you." Respect says, "You have been through difficult things, and I recognize the strength it took to become who you are." There is an enormous difference. You don't need someone to look at you as damaged. You need someone capable of seeing your humanity without reducing you to your wounds. That is what emotional maturity looks like. And perhaps this is where your relationship with yourself must change too. Because if you spend your entire life hiding your pain, you may eventually become ashamed of having it. You may think, I should be over this by now. But healing does not operate according to a universal schedule. You don't heal because enough months have passed. You heal because you begin processing what happened, understanding what it taught you, releasing what no longer serves you, and creating new experiences that contradict the old story. Your soulmate can become part of that new experience, but they cannot become the entire solution. They cannot carry your history for you. They cannot erase every memory. They cannot guarantee that you will never be hurt again. What they can do is show you that vulnerability does not always end in rejection. Consistency can exist, patience can exist, respect can exist. Someone can hear the difficult parts of your story and still choose to know you more deeply. And that realization can be revolutionary, because perhaps the greatest transformation is not that your soulmate finally sees your pain. It is that you finally stop believing your pain makes you unworthy of being loved. You begin to understand that your scars are part of your story, but they are not the definition of your identity. You are more than what happened to you. You are more than who disappointed you. You are more than the relationships that ended. You are more than the moments when you felt abandoned, misunderstood, or alone. And when your soulmate begins seeing that person, the whole person, they may finally understand why your strength is so remarkable. You didn't become strong because life was easy. You became strong because you kept choosing to move forward. So let the truth about your past become a bridge to deeper understanding, not a prison that keeps you trapped there. You don't have to hide every scar. You simply have to give the right people the opportunity to understand why you have them. Because real love does not ask, why aren't you untouched by life? Real love asks, after everything you've survived, how can I treat your heart with greater care? And sometimes, the moment someone finally recognizes your strength is the moment you finally recognize it too. Once someone understands your hidden pain, the relationship cannot remain exactly the same. Not necessarily because everything suddenly becomes perfect, but because understanding changes the way people interpret what they see. When the story behind your behavior becomes visible, your soulmate may begin approaching you with greater patience, greater care, and a deeper awareness of what your heart actually needs. And this is where words become less important than behavior. It is easy for someone to say, I understand you. It is much harder to demonstrate that understanding when circumstances become difficult. If your soulmate has genuinely absorbed the truth about your pain, you may notice subtle changes. They may stop pushing when you become quiet. They may ask questions instead of making assumptions. They may become more attentive to the moments when you retreat emotionally. They may recognize that certain situations trigger memories or fears that have nothing to do with the present moment. This does not mean they should walk on eggshells around you. Healthy love is not about treating someone as fragile. It is about learning how to treat someone with awareness. There is a difference. When people know your wounds, they gain information about the places where you need communication, honesty, and consistency. But that knowledge should not become a tool for control. A healthy partner doesn't memorize your vulnerabilities so they can use them against you. They understand them so they can avoid unnecessary harm and build greater trust. That distinction is enormous. Because trust is not created by one emotional conversation. Trust is created through repeated experiences. Someone says they will call, and they call. Someone promises honesty and then tells the truth even when the truth is uncomfortable. Someone says they respect your boundaries, and their behavior proves it. Over time, your nervous system begins learning something new. Maybe I don't have to be constantly defensive here. That is how emotional safety develops. It is not a dramatic event. It is a pattern. And your soulmate may now be realizing that what you needed was never perfection from them. You needed consistency. Perhaps you spent years believing that love always came with uncertainty. Maybe you became accustomed to questioning people's intentions. Maybe you learned to analyze every change in someone's tone because you were afraid that affection could disappear without warning. Then someone enters your life and behaves differently. They don't make you guess. They communicate. They don't disappear whenever things become emotionally complicated. They stay present. They don't punish you for having feelings. They listen. And slowly, something inside you begins to change. You stop preparing for abandonment. You stop expecting disappointment. You stop interpreting every moment of silence as a warning. This is why healthy relationships can be deeply transformative. They don't erase your history, but they can give your mind new evidence. Your past taught you one thing. Your present begins teaching you another. But there is another side to this transformation that we must acknowledge. If your soulmate now understands your pain, you must also allow them to understand your present needs. You cannot expect someone to read your mind simply because they know your history. If you need reassurance, communicate it. If something hurts you, explain it. If you need space, say so. If you're afraid, acknowledge the fear instead of turning it into anger. Because vulnerability is not simply telling someone what happened to you. Vulnerability is allowing them to know what is happening inside you now. And that requires courage. It requires you to stop testing people and start communicating with them. Instead of thinking, if they really love me, they'll know what I need. Learn to say, this is what I need. That is maturity. Your soulmate may understand your past, but they still need your honesty about the present. And this is where the relationship can become something much deeper. Two people are no longer reacting to each other's defenses. They are communicating with each other's reality. You begin to realize that you don't have to punish someone new for what someone from your past did. They begin to realize that your reactions sometimes come from experiences that existed long before they arrived. Both of you begin separating the past from the present. And that is powerful, because the goal isn't to create a relationship where nobody ever gets hurt. That is impossible. The goal is to create a relationship where hurt can be addressed without destroying the connection, where conflict leads to conversation instead of disappearance, where mistakes lead to accountability instead of manipulation, where vulnerability leads to greater understanding instead of shame. That is the kind of love that can actually withstand reality. So if your soulmate has finally learned the truth about your hidden pain, don't focus only on their emotional reaction. Watch the pattern that follows. Does their patience increase? Does their honesty deepen? Do their actions become more consistent? Do they respect your boundaries? Do they make space for your feelings without making you feel guilty for having them? Because understanding is meaningful only when it changes behavior. Anyone can say they care. The person who truly cares will allow that knowledge to transform how they treat you. And perhaps that is the real unexpected reaction you have been waiting for. Not a dramatic confession, not a perfect speech, but a quiet change in the way someone shows up. Because sometimes love doesn't announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it simply becomes safer. And when a person finally understands your pain, the most beautiful response is not, I feel sorry for you. It is, now that I know, I will be more careful with your heart. Yeah. And then they prove it. One consistent action at a time.